He thought he inherited a dying farm, but his dog uncovered something buried that would change everything. When Daniel Brooks returned to Pine Hollow after his father's death, he planned to sell the old farm and leave for good. The house was rotting, the land forgotten, and the memories heavier than the mountains around it. But on his first night back, his German shepherd, Shadow, refused to sleep. He kept pawing at the kitchen floor, like he knew something Daniel didn't. What they found beneath those boards wasn't just a hidden cellar. It was a secret that had been waiting for him his entire life. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know how far this story has reached. The road into Pine Hollow hadn't changed in 20 years. It still bent like a question mark through the Appalachian ridges, and climbing and dipping between dark pines and bare winter oaks. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the mountains like a lid. Daniel "Danny" Brooks drove with both hands locked on the steering wheel, knuckles pale, jaw tight. The old farm truck he'd borrowed from his father's neighbor rattled at every curve. He hadn't cried at the funeral, not when they lowered the casket, not when the pastor cleared his throat. Not when Margaret Hill, the family lawyer, pressed a folder into his hands and said softly, "Your father left you everything." Danny hadn't felt nothing. He'd felt too much, and that was the problem. Shadow shifted in the back seat, claws clicking softly against the truck bed liner. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every passing sound. He had aged, just like Danny had, gray brushing his muzzle now, but his eyes were still sharp, alert, watching, always watching. Danny glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "I'm not staying," he muttered. Shadow didn't blink. The town sign appeared around the bend. "Welcome to Pine Hollow. Population 1,342. The paint was peeling. The edges splintered, same as he remembered. A crack of sound exploded somewhere beyond the tree line. Danny slammed the brakes. His heart punched against his ribs. His breath vanished. For one sharp, blinding second, the mountains dissolved and the windshield filled with desert haze and smoke. His ears rang. His hands trembled on instinct, searching for a rifle that wasn't there. Another pop, fireworks, some early celebration from town, high school game maybe, or someone's birthday. Danny forced air into his lungs. "You're not there," he said under his breath. "You're not there." Shadow stood in the back seat now, braced, staring forward. Not panicked, just ready. Danny exhaled slowly and pressed the gas again. The farmhouse came into view nearly 30 minutes later, tucked deep beyond a gravel path that hadn't been graded in years. Snow clung to the fence posts. The barn leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of holding itself upright. The house stood at the center of it all. 2 stories, weather-beaten, paint faded to a color that might once have been white. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows. Danny cut the engine. Silence rushed in. It was bigger than he expected. Thicker. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start hearing things that aren't there. He stayed in the truck longer than necessary. Shadow hopped down first, landing in the snow with a soft crunch. He circled once, nose low, scanning the property. His body language shifted almost immediately, less relaxed than usual. His tail lowered slightly. His ears tilted toward the house. Danny stepped out. The cold cut clean through his coat. Not brutal, just honest. He walked toward the porch, boots sinking into snow that hadn't been disturbed since the funeral 2 days ago. Margaret had told him the estate papers would be ready by Friday. Sign them, list the property, let someone else deal with it. That had been the plan. Sell it. Split. Go back to Columbus. Back to the small apartment, with the blinds always half closed. The porch boards groaned under his weight. He remembered that sound from childhood. He remembered running across this porch at 10 years old, hearing his father shout about muddy boots. He remembered long summers here, and long winters when his father barely spoke. The key Margaret gave him felt heavier than it should. The lock resisted at first, then turned with a stiff click. The door opened into air that smelled like dust, old pine, and something faintly metallic. Cold lingered inside. The fireplace sat dark and empty. Furniture stood draped in sheets like forgotten ghosts. Danny stepped in. Shadow followed, paws quiet against the hardwood floor. The house felt smaller. Or maybe Danny felt bigger. He walked into the living room and stopped in front of the fireplace. The stonework was chipped near the bottom corner. He remembered helping his father stack firewood here one winter. His father's voice had been steady then, patient. Before the arguments, all before the silence, before Danny left for the army and never really came back. Shadow moved toward the kitchen, sniffing along the baseboards. Danny didn't follow. He stood in the center of the room, staring at nothing. His father had chosen this place over him. That's what he'd believed for years. Chosen isolation, chosen stubbornness, chosen this crumbling farm instead of reconciliation. The thought should have made him angry. It didn't. It just left him tired. He walked upstairs and opened the door to his old bedroom. The wallpaper still carried faint outlines of where posters once hung. The window overlooked the tree line. Snow coated everything in white silence. He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged the same way it always had. For a brief moment, he felt 12 again. Then the weight returned. He lay back, staring at the ceiling. The quiet grew louder. Somewhere downstairs, a floorboard creaked. Danny's eyes snapped open. He held still, listening. Wind. Old wood settling. Nothing else. Shadow barked once. Sharp. Controlled. Danny swung his legs off the bed and headed downstairs. His pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to expectation. His body never fully forgot how to prepare for danger. It just waited for it. Shadow stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the far wall. "Knock it off," Danny said, though his voice lacked conviction. Shadow didn't move. The kitchen was dim. Late afternoon light filtered through dusty glass. The linoleum near the sink peeled at the edges. Cabinets hung slightly crooked. Danny stepped in beside the dog. For a second, he saw nothing unusual. Then he heard it. It was a faint, uneven tick beneath his boots. Not the house settling. Something else. He looked down at the floor. The boards near the far corner didn't sit perfectly flush. One edge rose slightly, as if it had been disturbed once and never set right again. Shadow lowered his head and sniffed at it, then glanced up at Danny. Not anxious. Certain. Danny swallowed. "This isn't my problem," he muttered. He turned away. But he didn't leave the room. Instead, he stood there, staring at the old stove, the cracked window, the fading paint on the cabinets. He felt the familiar pull of avoidance, the same instinct that had kept him from unpacking certain memories for years. Sell the place. Sign the papers. Walk away. Another small shift under the floor. Shadow tapped the raised board with one paw. Danny closed his eyes. But when he opened them again, something inside him had shifted to film. Not curiosity, not yet, but the faintest crack in the numbness. He knelt down. The wood was cold under his fingers. "Just to see," he said quietly. Shadow stayed beside him, silent and steady. Outside, another distant firework popped against the winter sky. Danny flinched, but less this time. He pressed his palm flat against the board, and for the first time since he'd stepped back onto this property, He felt something other than emptiness. He felt watched. Not by the house, not by ghosts, but by possibility. The silence thickened around them, and the board did not move. Danny stayed crouched there longer than he meant to, palm pressed against the uneven wood, waiting for something, another sound, another shift, and some proof that he wasn't imagining it. Nothing came. Shadow let out a low breath and sat back on his haunches, eyes never leaving the corner of the kitchen. Danny pushed himself upright slowly, knees stiff from the cold floor. "Old house," he muttered. "That's all." The words didn't settle. He turned away from the board and walked back into the living room. The air felt heavier now, like the house had drawn a slow breath and was holding it. Outside, the wind began to move through the trees. It wasn't violent, just steady, persistent. The kind that slid under doors and along window seams and made a place whisper without meaning to. Shadow did not follow right away. Danny noticed. He glanced back. The dog was still in the kitchen doorway, head slightly tilted, ears forward, listening. "Shadow." The dog's gaze flicked to him, and then back to the floor. Danny's jaw tightened. "Come on." After a moment, Shadow obeyed, padding across the hardwood and settling near the fireplace. But he didn't lie down. He remained upright, watchful. Danny knelt in front of the hearth and began stacking the old firewood he'd found by the back door. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding him. Build the base. Leave space for air. Keep it small at first. He struck a match. The flame flared bright in the dim room. For a second, the flicker reflected in his eyes like muzzle flash. He blinked hard. The match touched paper. The paper caught. The fire hesitated, then slowly took hold, licking up the dry kindling. Orange light spilled across the stone and climbed the walls in soft, uneven shadows. Warmth didn't come right away. It never did. Danny sat back on his heels and watched the flames settle into a steady rhythm. Shadow finally lay down, but his body remained angled toward the kitchen. The sun slipped lower outside, turning the snow pale blue through the windows. The house creaked again, not sharply, not urgently, just a long, tired stretch of wood and nails adjusting to the cold. Danny leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes. He didn't mean to drift, but he did. A sudden crack split the quiet. Danny's body reacted before his mind caught up. He rolled to his side, heart hammering, breath gone. His shoulder struck the wooden coffee table. Pain shot through his arm. It took 2 seconds for reality to return. The fire had popped, a knot in the wood giving way. He was on the floor. Shadow was already standing over him. Danny let out a shaky breath and pushed himself up. "You're fine," he whispered. It wasn't clear who he was talking to. Night settled fully by the time he climbed the stairs. He carried an old lantern with him instead of turning on the overhead lights. Something about the house felt better in softer illumination. Less exposed, less stark. His father's bedroom door stood half open. Danny hesitated before stepping inside. The bed was neatly made. The dresser held a small stack of folded shirts. A Bible rested on the nightstand beside a pair of reading glasses. Dust lay thick across everything, but not untouched. Danny crossed the room slowly. There was a dent in the pillow, almost as if someone had just risen from it. He knew that wasn't possible. He knew it. Still, the sight tightened something in his chest. He moved to the window and looked out across the darkened yard. The barn stood in silhouette. The fence line disappeared into trees. He wondered how many nights his father had stood here like this. Watching. Waiting. For what? For him. The thought came uninvited and stayed. A floorboard shifted behind him. Danny spun around. The hallway was empty. Shadow stood at the top of the stairs, not barking, not growling, just staring toward the kitchen below. Slowly, Danny stepped into the hall. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog didn't move. Another faint sound drifted upward. Not loud, not urgent, just a soft, uneven tap. Danny's pulse quickened. He descended the stairs one step at a time. The fire downstairs burned low, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. The house felt different at night, larger somehow, and darker in its corners. Shadow moved ahead of him, paws silent. The kitchen doorway yawned open. Danny paused there, listening. The wind had died down. There was no sound from outside. But inside, there, a faint tick, under the floor. Danny stepped fully into the kitchen. The raised board caught the edge of the firelight now. Its uneven line seemed more obvious than before. Impossible to ignore. He swallowed. "You hear it too," he murmured. Shadow's ears twitched. Danny crouched again, slower this time. The wood was colder now. He pressed his ear near the floor. For a long moment, nothing. Then, a subtle shift. Not the random expansion of old boards. A deliberate movement. His chest tightened. Claustrophobia crept up his spine like a slow hand. The memory of narrow corridors, collapsed buildings, a dust in the lungs, it pressed against him before he could stop it. He jerked back, breathing hard. Shadow immediately moved closer, pressing against his side. Danny grabbed a fistful of the dog's fur, grounding himself. "I'm not there," he said again. The words felt weaker this time. The house did not reply, but it did not forget him either. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. The kitchen returned to stillness. Danny stayed there, kneeling until his breathing steadied. He didn't lift the board. Not yet. Instead, he stood and backed away slowly, as if the floor might suddenly open on its own. Shadow remained in place a second longer, then followed. They returned to the living room. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow began to fall again. Fine, steady flakes drifting across the dark. Danny sank onto the couch. But he wasn't sure how long he sat there. The house seemed to settle around him. And yet, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt aware. Not haunted. Just waiting. Shadow finally lay down beside the hearth, but his head remained lifted, eyes tracking every small shift of shadow across the ceiling. Danny leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He had planned to stay 2 nights, sign the papers, leave. Now, sitting in the dim glow of firelight with the faint memory of movement beneath the floor, that plan felt less certain. The house had not forgotten him, and whatever lay beneath that board had not forgotten either. Danny did not sleep much that night. He stretched out on the couch instead of going back upstairs. The fire burned low but steady, casting slow waves of amber light across the ceiling. But every time his eyes closed, they opened again just as quickly. Not because of a sound, not because of movement, because of expectation. Shadow never fully lay down. Even resting, the dog's head hovered inches above the floor, ears twitching at every subtle shift of wood and wind. At some point near dawn, Danny must have drifted off. He woke to a sound that did not belong to dreams. Scratch, sharp, deliberate. He sat upright instantly. Shadow was already on his feet. Scratch. It came from the kitchen. Not under the floor this time. On it. Danny swung his legs over the side of the couch and stood, heart thudding. Morning light filtered through the windows, pale and gray. Snow had fallen through the night, layering the yard in fresh silence. Shadow moved ahead of him, tail low but steady. Danny stepped into the kitchen. Joe's Shadow was at the raised board again. But this time the dog wasn't just sniffing, he was digging. One paw scraped across the wood with focused urgency, claws dragging against the uneven edge. "Shadow," Danny said, sharper than he intended. The dog didn't stop. Scratch, scratch. The sound cut straight through Danny's nerves. He stepped forward and grabbed Shadow gently by the collar. "That's enough." Shadow resisted, not violently, but firmly. He leaned his weight toward the board, eyes locked on it, body tense in a way Danny knew too well. This wasn't curiosity. This was alert. Danny's throat tightened. He released the collar slowly. "Okay," he said under his breath. "Okay." He crouched again. The board looked the same as last night, slightly raised at one end, a faint line tracing its outline. But he ran his fingers along the seam. There. Cold metal. A small ring embedded into the wood. Danny froze. The ring lay flush with the surface, almost invisible beneath dust and age. He brushed the dirt away carefully. The circle gleamed faintly in the morning light. Shadow sat back, but didn't move his gaze. Danny stared at the ring for a long moment. He could still walk away. "Call Margaret. Tell her the place was unstable. Sign the papers. Never know what lay beneath." His hand hovered above the metal. The air felt thinner now. He wrapped his fingers around the ring. It was icy against his skin. "Just to look," he murmured. He pulled. The board resisted at first, then shifted with a long, protesting groan that echoed through the kitchen. Dust burst upward. Danny coughed. Danny, blinking hard as the wood lifted enough to reveal darkness beneath. Not empty darkness, structured darkness. A square opening cut clean into the floor. Cold air rushed upward, carrying a scent of damp stone and old earth. Shadow stepped closer and peered down without hesitation. Danny swallowed. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into the black. His pulse spiked. The sight of the tight, enclosed stairwell hit him like a physical blow. His vision narrowed for half a second. The kitchen blurred. The world shrank to the shape of that opening. Tight. Confined. Unknown. He stepped back abruptly. His breathing quickened. The memory of narrow hallways overseas pressed in from all sides. Collapsed walls. Dust in his throat. The sound of his own heartbeat inside a helmet. Shadow nudged his hand. Solid. Real. Present. Danny focused on the dog's fur beneath his palm. "You're here," he whispered. The present returned in small pieces. The kitchen. The snow beyond the window. The faint crackle of dying embers in the living room. The stairs remained, waiting. Danny crossed to the counter and grabbed his father's old flashlight from a drawer he hadn't opened in years. He tested it. The beam flickered once, then steadied. He crouched again. "Stay close," he said. Shadow didn't hesitate. Danny angled the flashlight down into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness. Stone walls, wooden supports, a landing at the bottom, not a crawl space, a room. The air rising from below felt colder than the rest of the house. Still, undisturbed, Danny placed one foot on the first step. The wood creaked beneath his weight, and his chest tightened again, but not enough to stop him. Shadow descended first, slow, measured, confident. Danny followed. Each step echoed louder than it should have. The sound traveled down the narrow shaft and bounced back up at him, amplifying the sensation of descent. He reached the bottom. The room revealed itself slowly as the beam moved across it. Stone walls stacked by hand, heavy timber beams darkened with age, a small iron stove in the corner, and a cot. A rusted metal frame with a thin mattress still resting on top. Danny's stomach dropped. This wasn't storage. This was habitation. Shadow moved forward, sniffing along the floor, then around the cot. His posture remained alert but calm. Danny stepped fully into the space. There was a wooden table against the far wall, and on it, not tools, not crates, books, and dozens of them. Leather-bound notebooks stacked in careful rows. Danny approached slowly, as if the air might shift if he moved too quickly. He picked up the top one. The leather was worn smooth at the edges. The spine cracked slightly as he opened it. Inside, handwriting. Neat, measured, steady. His father's name was not on the first page. Another name was. Thomas Brooks, Winter, 1953. Danny frowned. His grandfather. He flipped a few pages. Short entries. Dated by hand. 2 tonight. Man with broken ribs. Stayed until snow cleared. Another page. Saw headlights near ridge. Kept stove low. Danny's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned another page. Sheriff asking questions again. He looked around the room, the cot, the stove, the table. This wasn't random. This wasn't forgotten. This was deliberate. Now Shadow stopped at the base of the stairs and looked back at him, as if confirming what Danny already felt. This place had been used, not long ago. Danny flipped further ahead. The handwriting shifted slightly over the years. The ink darkened and faded in places. Then, a different name. Samuel Brooks, his great-grandfather. The entries went back decades. People, injuries, snowstorms, warnings about headlights and strangers. Danny lowered himself into the chair beside the table. The air in the cellar felt denser now, heavy with memory. He ran a hand through his hair. His father had never spoken of this. Not once. Not when Danny left. Not when he returned on short visits. Not even during their worst arguments. Another line caught his eye. Keep the fire burning. The words were underlined once. Danny's throat tightened. He had heard his father say that phrase before. Not here, but years ago. During a winter power outage, Danny had been 16, cold, angry, ready to leave. His father had said it quietly while feeding logs into the hearth. Keep the fire burning. Danny hadn't understood. Now, sitting beneath the kitchen floor with decades of hidden history in his hands, he felt something inside him shift. Not comfort. Not yet. But recognition. Shadow returned to his side and pressed against his leg. Danny reached down automatically. The cellar was silent again, but not empty. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, Danny didn't feel alone. He sat there for a long moment, the old notebook resting open on the wooden table, the scent of aged paper and damp stone filling his lungs. Now Shadow's steady warmth pressed against his leg. The cellar did not feel threatening anymore. It felt intentional. Danny turned another page. The entries were brief, sometimes only a single line. Mother and child. Stayed 3 nights. Truck seen near the ridge. Waited until morning. Left before dawn. No names. No names. That detail struck him harder than the rest. His grandfather had written about these people like weather reports. No judgment. No explanation. Just presence, just fact. He reached for another notebook. This one older. The leather more cracked. The ink more faded. Samuel Brooks. Winter 1918. Danny exhaled slowly. The year lingered in his mind. The end of the First World War. A country rebuilding itself. Men returning home carrying things they would never speak of. He read. 2 tonight. On 1 coughing blood. Kept stove low. Another page. Riders passed twice. Didn't knock. Danny's jaw tightened. This wasn't random shelter. This was hiding. Shadow shifted slightly, then moved toward the far corner of the cellar. He sniffed near the stove, then returned, tail giving a small, thoughtful sweep. Danny closed the notebook and looked around more carefully. The cot had been used. The mattress wasn't collapsed from age. It was worn from weight. The stovepipe had been cleaned at some point in recent decades. A tin cup sat on the table, still upright. This place had not been abandoned. Not entirely. He climbed back up the stairs slowly, carrying one of the notebooks with him. Shadow followed close behind, paws steady on the wood. The kitchen felt brighter now that he knew what lay beneath it, and he lowered the board gently back into place. It settled into its uneven seam with a quiet thud. Danny stood there, staring at the floor. His father had lived above this for years. All those nights. All that silence. And he had never said a word. Danny moved into the living room and sat by the fire. The flames had grown stronger while he was below, casting long waves of light across the walls. He opened the notebook again. Near the back, the handwriting changed. The strokes became firmer, more recent. Thomas Brooks, his father. Danny's breath caught. The entries were dated only a few years ago. Man from Beckley, bruised ribs, stayed 2 nights. Girl, maybe 16, wouldn't speak, left before sunrise. Danny swallowed. The same pattern. No names, no details beyond necessity. Then he turned the page, the final entry. The ink darker, pressed harder into the paper. If Danny ever returns, he'll understand why I stayed. The words blurred. Danny blinked, but the sting in his eyes didn't fade. He had told himself for years that his father chose this farm over him. That stubborn pride mattered more than reconciliation. That silence meant indifference. But this wasn't indifference. This was duty. Danny lowered his head. His father hadn't chased him to Columbus. Hadn't shown up unannounced. Hadn't called every week. But he had stayed here, guarding something, protecting someone. Danny's shoulders began to shake before he realized what was happening. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried when the casket was lowered. He cried now. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet. Got broken breaths that escaped before he could stop them. Shadow moved immediately, pressing his body against Danny's knee, then lifting his head into Danny's hand. Danny gripped the dog's fur. "I thought you chose this place over me," he whispered. The fire popped softly behind him. The house creaked again, not ominous this time, just alive. He read the line again. If Danny ever returns, he'll understand why I stayed. His father had known that one day maybe Danny would come back, not to sell, not to bury, but to see. Danny wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. The numbness that had followed him for years didn't disappear, but it cracked. And through that crack, something warmer slipped in. He rose slowly and walked back into the kitchen. He knelt and lifted the board once more, staring down into the cellar. This wasn't a secret buried in shame. It was a legacy buried in protection. He replaced the board carefully again. When he stood, the house no longer felt like a weight pressing down on him. It felt like a question. Outside, the clouds began to thin. Pale afternoon light filtered across the snow, soft and uncertain. Danny stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit his face, sharp and grounding. He looked out over the property. The barn leaned tiredly. The fence sagged. The road beyond the trees disappeared into white hills. He imagined headlights approaching at night. Imagined someone walking up that drive, unsure, desperate. He imagined his father standing where he stood now, watching, waiting. Shadow came to stand beside him. Danny rested a hand on the dog's back. You knew, he murmured. Oh, didn't you? Shadow didn't answer, but he didn't look away from the tree line either. A truck engine sounded faintly in the distance. Danny stiffened instinctively. The sound grew louder. Gravel crunched along the drive. A dark SUV came into view, climbing the narrow path toward the farmhouse. Danny's jaw tightened. The vehicle stopped near the porch. A man stepped out. Mid-50s, expensive coat, clean boots that didn't belong on snow like this. Clayton Reed. Danny recognized him from the funeral. The man had introduced himself briefly, a friend of the family, interested in land development in the region. Clayton adjusted his gloves and smiled thinly. "Mr. Brooks," he called out. "Glad I caught you before you headed back to the city." Danny didn't respond immediately. Shadow stood tall beside him now, ears forward, whilst Clayton climbed the porch steps without waiting for an invitation. "I understand you inherited quite a bit of acreage here," he said smoothly. "Prime property, if you know what to look for." Danny's expression hardened. "I'm not looking." Clayton chuckled lightly. "You should. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when there are stories." Danny felt something shift in his chest. "Stories?" he asked evenly. Clayton's eyes flicked toward the kitchen window. About hidden spaces, old structures, things that might not meet modern safety codes. The air between them cooled further. Danny said nothing. Clayton stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I can make this simple for you. You sign over the property. I take care of the rest. No inspections. No unwanted attention." Danny held his gaze. "Huh? And if I don't?" Clayton's smile thinned. "Well," he said lightly, "the county can be very curious about what's buried on private land." Shadow let out a low, controlled growl. Clayton glanced down at the dog and took half a step back. Danny's voice was calm when he finally spoke. "You're on my porch." Clayton studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Think about it," he said. "These mountains don't reward sentiment." He turned and walked back to his SUV. The engine roared to life. Gravel spat beneath the tires as he reversed down the drive and disappeared behind the trees. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. Danny stood there, eyes fixed on the place where the vehicle had vanished. Shadow pressed against his leg again. Danny exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a family secret, but it was something others wanted, and that meant it mattered. He looked down at Shadow. "We're not done here," he said quietly. The fire inside the house crackled again, stronger now, and beneath the kitchen floor, the past waited. Danny did not go back down immediately. Instead, he stood on the porch long after Clayton Reed's SUV had disappeared down the narrow mountain road. Snow clung to the tire tracks, slowly softening their sharp edges. The mountains were quiet again, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was watchful. Shadow stayed at his side, muscles relaxed, but eyes alert. Danny finally turned and went back inside. He shut the door firmly behind him, as if sealing something in or out. The house felt different now. Not haunted, not threatening. Guarded, and he walked straight into the kitchen and knelt without hesitation this time. His hands moved with steadier purpose as he lifted the board again. The metal ring felt less foreign beneath his fingers. The stairwell yawned open. Cold air rose up to meet him. "Stay close," he murmured. Shadow descended first, moving carefully but confidently down the narrow steps. Danny followed, slower, breath measured. The cellar no longer sent his pulse racing. The tight walls still brushed close around him, but the panic that had clawed at his throat the night before had eased. It was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled him. He reached the bottom and went straight to the stack of notebooks. The one he'd taken upstairs lay open on the table where he'd left it. The final entry from his father burned in his memory. Thus, if Danny ever returns, he'll understand why I stayed. He picked up another notebook from the bottom of the stack, thicker, more recent. The leather cover was less worn, the edges sharper. He opened it. Thomas Brooks. His father's handwriting was unmistakable now. Firm, angular, no wasted strokes. Danny turned pages slowly. Snow came early this year. Road nearly blocked. Truck seen near Mill Road. Didn't stop. 3 nights. Man wouldn't give name. Left before dawn. Danny's chest tightened. This wasn't ancient history. This had been happening while Danny was deployed overseas, while he was building a life somewhere else, while he was telling himself his father had chosen isolation. The final pages were dated only months before his father's death. Danny swallowed and turned one more page. There it was. His name, not in the margin, not hidden, written clearly in the center of the page. Danny called tonight, said he might come by Christmas. The ink had pressed deeper into the paper there. Danny's hand trembled. He remembered that call. He had been sitting in his apartment in Columbus, staring at a blinking Christmas tree he'd barely bothered to decorate. The holidays always hit harder than he expected. He had dialed the old farmhouse number almost without thinking. His father had answered on the 3rd ring. They had talked for 7 minutes. 7 minutes of careful, polite words. Danny had said, "I might come by Christmas." His father had paused, then said quietly, "Doors always open." Danny never went. Another entry followed. Didn't come. Snow heavy this year. The words were simple, but Danny felt them like a weight on his ribs. He turned the page. Nothing. The notebook ended there. Danny stared at the blank paper for a long time. His father hadn't written anger, hadn't written disappointment, just fact. Snow heavy this year. Danny lowered himself into the chair again. Shadow came to sit beside him, resting his chin on Danny's knee. "I thought you stopped waiting," Danny whispered. The stone walls held the words gently. He imagined his father down here, lantern burning low, pen moving across paper. Imagined him climbing those stairs after someone left at dawn. Imagined him standing in the kitchen, looking at that same uneven board. Waiting. Not just for strangers on the run. For his son. Danny felt something break open inside his chest, something older than grief. He bowed his head, and this time the tears came freely. They fell onto the open notebook, blurring the ink slightly before he wiped them away with shaking fingers. "I'm sorry," he said aloud. Shadow shifted closer. The cellar did not echo his apology. It absorbed it. Danny sat there until the tightness in his throat eased and his breathing steadied. When he finally rose, he didn't feel lighter, but he felt clearer. He gathered several of the notebooks and carried them upstairs. Back in the living room, he placed them carefully on the coffee table beside the fire. Flames licked higher now, casting warmth that reached deeper into the room than before. He flipped through one more notebook at random. The phrase appeared again. "Keep the fire burning." Different handwriting. Different decade. Same words. Danny leaned back slowly. Well, this wasn't about secrecy. It was about continuity. He thought of Clayton's warning. Inspections, questions, codes. He thought of his father's quiet resolve. He thought of the entry with his own name written into it. For years, Danny had believed his father chose the farm over him. Now he understood something far more complicated. His father hadn't chosen the farm. He had chosen the responsibility. Chosen to stay so someone else could leave. Chosen to hold the line in a different way. Danny stood and walked back into the kitchen. He lowered the board again, but this time he didn't hesitate before setting it into place. The wood fit as it always had, hidden, protected. Shadow watched him carefully. "You knew this wasn't just old lumber," Danny said softly. The dog blinked. Outside, while clouds thickened over the mountains again, snow began to fall in small, steady flakes. Danny moved to the window and looked out across the property. The road beyond the trees lay quiet, but not empty. Clayton's words echoed faintly in his mind. "These mountains don't reward sentiment." Danny's jaw set. Maybe not. But they did remember. He glanced back toward the living room, where the notebooks rested beside the fire. The house no longer felt like something he needed to escape. It felt like something he had stepped into, a current that had been flowing long before him, and would continue long after. Shadow rose and walked to the front door, sitting there quietly, as if expecting something. Danny frowned. "What is it?" Shadow's ears lifted. A faint sound drifted through the snowfall. Not an engine. Not yet. Oh, something else. Danny opened the door slightly and listened. Wind, trees. Then, a distant rumble. Low. Approaching. Not the smooth hum of a luxury SUV this time. Rougher. Older. Coming up the mountain road. Danny stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing against the falling snow. Headlights appeared through the trees. Slow. Uncertain. Not Clayton. A different truck. It crested the bend and rolled cautiously toward the farmhouse, tires slipping slightly on fresh snow. Danny's pulse quickened. Shadow moved beside him, body tense but not aggressive. The truck stopped halfway up the drive. Its engine idled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A thin figure stepped out into the snow, small, young, wrapped in a coat far too light for the weather. The wind caught the edge of her hood and tore it back. A teenage girl. She stood there, shivering, and she did not move closer. Danny felt his heart begin to pound again, but this time not from fear. From recognition. The notebooks. The cot downstairs. The phrase written over and over again. Keep the fire burning. The girl took one tentative step forward, then another. Snow gathered in her hair. Danny glanced down at Shadow. The dog's gaze never left the figure in the driveway. Danny drew in a long breath. The fire crackled behind him, and the door was already open. Cold air swept into the farmhouse, carrying the sharp scent of pine and snow. It curled around Danny's boots and slipped across the floorboards like something alive. He stood on the porch, shoulders squared, watching the girl in the driveway. She couldn't have been more than 15. Her coat was too thin, sneakers soaked through, one sleeve torn at the cuff. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting. She was just standing there, like she didn't expect to be let in. Shadow stepped forward first, not barking, not growling, just moving with quiet certainty. Danny followed slowly, boots crunching over fresh snow. "You okay?" he called out, voice steady but not loud. The girl hesitated before answering. Her voice cracked from cold more than emotion. "My truck won't start." Danny glanced toward the old pickup idling halfway up the drive. Steam drifted from the hood. "You alone?" She nodded. Shadow circled her once, nose low, reading what Danny couldn't. The dog's posture softened slightly. No alarm, no aggression. Danny noticed her hands. They were shaking. "Come inside," he said finally. She didn't move. He recognized that look, the kind that calculates risk against survival. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added quietly. "There's heat." The wind kicked up, sending snow sideways across the yard. The girl flinched. Shadow stepped closer and sat down near her boots, as if staking a calm claim. Something in her face shifted. She followed them. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace wrapped around her immediately. She stopped just past the doorway and held her hands out toward the flames. Danny shut the door firmly. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Lily." "Lily what?" Another pause. "Carter." Danny nodded slowly. "I'm Danny. That's Shadow." Shadow's ears twitched at his name. Lily looked down at the dog, uncertain. "He won't bite," Danny said. Not unless I tell him to." It was meant to reassure. It didn't entirely. Danny grabbed a blanket from the couch and handed it to her. She wrapped it around herself but stayed standing, as if sitting down might mean staying too long. "Where you headed?" he asked gently. She looked toward the window instead of answering. "South," she said finally. "That's a long way from here." She nodded again. Danny didn't push further. The wind outside intensified, rattling the window panes. Snow began falling harder, thicker now, blurring the trees beyond the yard. Lily's eyes flicked toward the sound. "You can't drive in that," Danny said calmly. "Not tonight." Her jaw tightened. "I have to. Truck's not going anywhere in this." The truth hung between them. Shadow rose and walked to the kitchen doorway, as Danny felt it before he heard it. A low rumble in the distance. Engine. Not Lily's. Danny's shoulders stiffened. Headlights flashed briefly through the trees before disappearing behind snowfall. Lily went pale. Danny noticed. "Expecting someone?" he asked quietly. She shook her head too quickly. The rumble grew louder. Shadow moved to the front door and stood rigid, ears forward. Danny stepped past Lily and opened the door just enough to look out. Through the swirling snow, he saw a pair of headlights climbing the ridge road again. Not hesitant, determined. His pulse quickened, not with panic this time, but awareness. The vehicle crested the bend. Dark. SUV. Clayton Reed. Danny's jaw tightened. The SUV slowed near the edge of the property, but didn't pull all the way in. It idled at the top of the drive, lights cutting through snow. Lily's breath became shallow. "He can't know I'm here," she whispered. Danny turned slowly. "Who?" She swallowed. "My stepdad." The word settled heavy in the room. Danny glanced back toward the idling SUV. Clayton. Of course, not just land. People. Shadow let out a low growl. Danny placed a hand on the dog's collar. "Easy." The SUV lights dimmed slightly, but did not turn off. Waiting. Danny's mind moved quickly now. If Clayton saw Lily's truck, if he came up the drive, if he stepped inside. The notebooks flashed through Danny's memory. The cot, the stove, the phrase repeated for generations. "Keep the fire burning." Lily's eyes were wide now, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was bracing. Danny made a decision. "Kitchen," he said quietly. Lily hesitated. "Oh, trust me." Shadow moved first. Danny lifted the board with steady hands. The opening yawned dark beneath the floor. Lily stared at it. "You want me to—" "Yes." Her fear spiked visibly, but so did her understanding. She stepped down carefully. Shadow followed close behind her. Danny listened. The SUV door opened outside. Boots hit snow. Clayton's silhouette moved through the falling flakes. Danny replaced the board just as footsteps hit the porch. A knock, firm, measured, 3 times. Danny took a slow breath and walked to the door. He opened it halfway. Clayton stood there, snow gathering on his shoulders. "Evening," Clayton said lightly. "Storm's coming down harder than expected." Danny nodded. "Yeah." Clayton glanced over Danny's shoulder. "You alone?" Danny met his gaze evenly. "Yeah." Clayton smiled thinly. "Funny thing, I saw a truck stuck halfway down your drive. Danny didn't blink. Probably someone lost. Clayton's eyes narrowed slightly. In this weather. Seems unlikely. Danny shifted his stance, blocking the doorway more fully. Anything else? Clayton held his gaze for a long moment. The wind howled between them. Finally, Clayton exhaled. Just thought I'd remind you, he said softly, that the county doesn't look kindly on harboring situations. Danny's expression hardened. Good thing there's no situation. Shadow's faint movement beneath the floorboards went unheard above the wind. Clayton studied him, then stepped back. Sleep well, Mr. Brooks. He returned to his SUV. The engine roared louder than necessary as it reversed down the road and disappeared into snow. Danny closed the door. He stood there listening long after the sound faded. Only when he was certain the vehicle was gone did he return to the kitchen. He knelt and lifted the board. Lily stood halfway up the steps, pale but composed. Shadow stood in front of her like a silent shield. It's okay, Danny said. She climbed out slowly. The fire burned steady in the living room. Snow battered the windows harder now. Lily wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Danny looked at the closed door, then at the board beneath his feet. Yeah, he said quietly. I did. Shadow returned to the hearth and lay down, but his eyes remained open. The storm thickened outside. Inside, the fire burned brighter, and somewhere beneath the kitchen floor, a legacy had just been chosen. But the storm did not let up. Snow hammered the windows through the night, piling against the porch steps, swallowing the tire tracks Clayton had left behind. The wind pushed hard at the walls as if testing their strength. Inside, the fire held steady. Danny stayed awake long after Lily fell asleep on the couch, wrapped tight in 2 blankets. He had given her dry socks and one of his father's old flannel shirts. It hung loose on her shoulders. Shadow lay at the base of the couch, positioned between her and the front door. Danny sat in the chair nearest the hearth, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. His thoughts moved slowly, deliberately. He had crossed a line. Not legally, not yet, but morally. He had chosen to open the door. He had chosen not to look away. And Clayton Reed had seen enough to suspect. What the wind screamed down the chimney, then softened again. The house groaned but did not yield. At some point near dawn, Danny drifted into a shallow sleep. He woke to shouting. Not inside, outside. Danny was on his feet before he fully understood what had pulled him from sleep. Shadow was already moving, fast, sharp, alert. The shouting came from the drive. A man's voice, angry, demanding. Lily bolted upright on the couch, eyes wide. That's him, she whispered. Danny's jaw tightened. Headlights cut through the storm-muted morning, glaring against the farmhouse windows. Clayton's SUV had returned. This time it wasn't alone. A second vehicle, a county patrol truck, sat angled near the gate. Danny felt his pulse quicken, but he did not retreat. He stepped toward the door. Shadow moved beside him, body stiff. Stay here, Danny told Lily quietly. She didn't argue. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying raised voices. Clayton stood near the patrol truck, speaking to a uniformed deputy Danny recognized from town, Deputy Harris. Clayton turned when he saw Danny. There he is, Clayton called out. Morning, Mr. Brooks. Deputy Harris stepped forward. Danny, he said carefully, got a call about suspicious activity up here. Figured we'd check it out. Danny kept his voice even. Suspicious how? Clayton gestured toward the house. Possible illegal occupancy, unsafe structures. You know how rumors spread. Danny looked from Clayton to Harris. You see anyone else here? Harris hesitated. No. Clayton's eyes flicked past Danny toward the interior. Mind if we take a look? He asked smoothly. Danny's spine stiffened. You have a warrant? Clayton smiled faintly. Harris shifted uncomfortably. No warrant, the deputy admitted. Just checking welfare. Danny stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Welfare's fine, he said calmly. Storm hit hard. I'm staying put. Clayton studied him. You sure about that? He asked softly. Danny held his gaze. Very. The wind howled between them again, driving snow across the yard. Harris looked toward the vehicles, then back at Danny. If there's nothing going on, we'll head out, he said. Clayton did not move immediately. His expression hardened just slightly. This land's going to change soon, he said quietly. Might as well get ahead of it. Danny's jaw flexed. Clayton turned and walked back toward his SUV. The deputy gave Danny a short nod before climbing into his patrol truck. Engines roared. Tires spun. Both vehicles disappeared down the drive. Danny stood there long after they were gone. When he finally stepped back inside, he shut the door firmly. Lily stood in the living room, hands clenched at her sides. They'll come back, she said. Danny didn't deny it. Maybe. Shadow paced once, then stopped near the kitchen entrance. Danny felt it before he heard it. A faint scrape near the side of the house. Not wind, not snow. Intentional. Shadow's ears snapped forward. Danny moved toward the back door slowly. The scrape came again, closer now. He opened the door a fraction and stepped out along the side of the house. Snow whipped across his face. He saw movement near the tree line, a shadow slipping between trunks. Too fast to be certain. Shadow lunged past him before he could react. Shadow! The dog tore through snow with powerful strides, barking sharply now. The figure turned, ran. Danny sprinted after them, boots slipping against ice beneath fresh powder. Shadow closed the distance quickly. A shout echoed through the trees, then a sharp cry. Danny's heart dropped. He pushed harder. He found Shadow near the edge of the property line. The dog had tackled a man to the ground, pinning him but not biting. The man struggled weakly. Get him off! The stranger yelled. Danny grabbed Shadow's collar and pulled him back with effort. Shadow obeyed, but stayed between Danny and the man. The stranger scrambled up, snow clinging to his coat. It wasn't Clayton. Younger, nervous, eyes darting. What were you doing? Danny demanded. The man hesitated. Just looking, he muttered. At what? The man's gaze flicked toward the house. Clayton said there might be things worth checking. Danny's stomach turned cold. Shadow stepped forward again, teeth bared slightly. The man backed away. Tell Clayton, Danny said evenly, that if he steps on my land again without cause, I won't be as patient. The man swallowed hard and turned, disappearing through the trees. Danny stood there, breath fogging in the air. Shadow remained rigid, scanning the ridge. Good boy, Danny murmured, kneeling briefly to inspect the dog. That's when he saw it. Blood. Not much, but enough. A thin line running along Shadow's shoulder where ice or brush had cut through fur. Danny's throat tightened. Let me see. Shadow resisted slightly, but allowed Danny to examine the wound. As it wasn't deep, but it was fresh. Danny's hands trembled, not from fear of the injury, from memory, from the sight of blood on fur, from the echo of other fields, other losses. You're okay, he whispered. Shadow's tail gave one small, reassuring wag. Danny guided him back toward the house. Inside, Lily rushed forward. Is he? He's fine, Danny said, though his voice betrayed the tremor beneath it. He cleaned the wound carefully at the kitchen sink. Shadow didn't flinch, didn't pull away. just watched Danny with steady eyes. Lily hovered nearby, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "He was protecting you," she said softly. Danny nodded once. "He always does." Outside, the storm began to ease. Snow fell slower now, quieter. But the threat had shifted. This wasn't just about land. Clayton was testing boundaries. Testing Danny. Testing the legacy beneath the floor. Danny dried Shadow's fur and knelt beside him, pressing his forehead briefly against the dog's. "I won't let this take you," he said under his breath. Shadow exhaled warm air against his cheek. The fire crackled behind them. Upstairs, the wind finally softened. Danny stood and looked toward the kitchen floor. The board lay silent, hidden, protected, but no longer safe from attention. He understood now. Kindness had a cost, and he had just paid the first installment. The snow stopped sometime after noon, but the cold settled deeper. Danny noticed it first in Shadow's walk. The dog tried to hide it. He always did. But by late afternoon, the slight cut on his shoulder had stiffened. His stride shortened. His back leg compensated too much. When he lay down, it took him longer than usual. Danny knelt beside him again near the hearth. "You're not fooling me," he murmured. Shadow lifted his head, ears tilting, eyes steady, loyal, uncomplaining. The wound had looked shallow in the morning. Now the fur around it had clumped slightly. Red seeped through the bandage Danny had wrapped. Guilt hit him harder than the wind had the night before. "You didn't have to chase him," Danny whispered. Shadow blinked slowly, but they both knew that wasn't true. He had to. That was what he was trained for, what he was wired for, what he had always done, overseas, and now here. Danny stood abruptly. "We're going to town." Lily looked up from the kitchen table where she had been quietly folding one of Danny's father's old towels. "In this?" she asked. The road beyond the driveway was still coated in packed snow. Danny nodded. "He needs a vet." He grabbed his coat, keys, and helped Shadow carefully into the truck. The dog climbed in without hesitation, though the effort showed in his shoulders. Lily hovered near the porch. "I can stay," she offered quickly. "I won't touch anything." Danny paused. He studied her for a moment. The fear in her eyes had softened into something else now, something closer to trust. "You'll lock the door?" he asked. She nodded. "Don't open it for anyone." "I won't." Shadow settled in the passenger seat, breathing slow but heavier than usual. Danny started the engine. The drive to Pine Hollow took nearly an hour on roads that should have taken 30 minutes. Snow clung stubbornly to shaded stretches of pavement. The truck slid more than once, but each time Danny's pulse spiked. Each time Shadow steadied himself without complaint. The veterinary clinic sat beside the old feed store near the center of town. A faded sign read, "Pine Hollow Animal Care." Dr. Evelyn Hart had treated Shadow once before, years ago when Danny first moved back to Ohio and later returned during a visit home. She recognized them instantly. "What happened?" she asked gently as Danny carried Shadow inside. "Cut," Danny replied. "Shoulder. Might have strained something." Dr. Hart examined the wound with quiet efficiency. Her hands were steady, calm. "It's deeper than it looks," she said finally. "Ice and debris likely drove it in farther. There's inflammation already." Danny's stomach tightened. "Will he? He'll recover," she said firmly. "But he needs rest, real rest. Well, no chasing strangers through snow." Shadow thumped his tail once, as if mildly offended. Dr. Hart cleaned the wound thoroughly and administered antibiotics. She wrapped the shoulder carefully, then looked at Danny. "You've been back at the farm?" she asked. Danny nodded. She hesitated. Your father was protective of that place. I know, Danny said quietly. She studied him a moment longer, as if weighing something unsaid. Be careful, she added softly. Danny met her eyes. I will. The drive back felt longer. Shadow rested his head against the door this time, eyes half closed. Danny's thoughts turned dark during that stretch of road. What if the next time it wasn't a shallow cut? What if Clayton escalated? What if Lily's presence made things worse? What if he couldn't protect either of them? Or if the old instinct crept in, the one that told him to cut losses early, remove risk, eliminate exposure, sell the land, walk away, keep Shadow safe. The farmhouse came into view as dusk settled across the hills. Smoke still rose faintly from the chimney. Lily had kept the fire going. Danny parked and stepped out into the brittle air. He helped Shadow down gently and guided him inside. The warmth hit them immediately. Lily stood near the hearth. I fed the fire, she said quietly. Danny nodded. Good. Shadow lowered himself slowly onto his usual spot by the flames. Danny crouched beside him, fingers brushing the bandage. You're going to listen this time, he said softly. No hero stuff. Shadow's tail gave the faintest tap against the floor. Danny leaned back against the couch. The room felt smaller now, more fragile. While Clayton had resources, money, influence. Danny had an aging farmhouse, a teenage girl with nowhere else to go, and a wounded dog. He closed his eyes. The fire cracked loudly. For a split second, his mind slipped again. Flash of sound, flash of memory, but he forced himself back. You okay? Lily asked. Danny opened his eyes. Yeah. She studied him carefully. You look like you're somewhere else. He gave a faint smile. Sometimes I am. Silence settled between them. After a moment, Lily stood. I'll go, she said suddenly. Danny looked up sharply. What? I don't want him coming back because of me. That's not how this works. She shook her head. I'll figure something out. Shadow lifted his head. Danny felt something inside him teeter dangerously close to collapse. If she left, Clayton would win. If she stayed, one danger would follow. The notebooks flashed in his mind again. Keep the fire burning. But fires go out. They run out of wood. They run out of strength. Danny stood slowly. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. But you're not leaving tonight. Lily's jaw trembled just slightly. I don't want to cause trouble. You didn't. The truth felt heavy. Clayton would come again. With paperwork. With pressure. With something bigger. Danny walked toward the kitchen, eyes falling on the uneven board. He imagined selling the property. Imagined bulldozers tearing through the floor. Concrete poured over stone. The cellar sealed forever. He imagined Shadow safe in a small apartment somewhere far from Pine Hollow. He imagined quiet. The thought hollowed him out. He turned back toward the fire. Shadow lay there, eyes half open, but watching him. Not fearful, not uncertain, trusting. Danny sat down heavily in the chair. The fire flickered lower than before. Lily moved quietly toward the table. She picked up a small piece of scrap wood from the corner, left over from an old crate, and carved something into it with a pocket knife she'd found in the drawer. Danny watched without asking. After a few minutes, she placed the wood on the mantel beside the old notebooks. Danny rose and stepped closer. The carving was simple. You saved me. The words weren't neat, but they were steady. Danny stared at them for a long time. The fire popped again, sending a small burst of sparks up the chimney. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the flames might fade. Shadow shifted closer to the heat. Danny reached for another log and fed the fire. But the flames responded slowly at first, licking the fresh wood with cautious hunger before rising stronger. Light pushed back against the dim corners of the farmhouse. Shadow watched him through half-lidded eyes. Lily remained by the mantel, staring at the carved words she had left behind. "You saved me." Danny stood there longer than he meant to. He wasn't sure if the fire needed the log more, or if he did. That night passed without headlights on the ridge. No engines, no knocks. But tension remained, stretched thin across the beams of the house. The next morning dawned clear and painfully bright. Snow reflected sunlight so sharply it forced Danny to squint when he stepped outside. The world looked clean. Too clean. He spent the early hours reinforcing what he could, clearing the driveway, checking the barn door hinges, just making sure the side windows were secured. Shadow followed at a slower pace now, bandage bright against dark fur. He refused to stay inside. "You're supposed to rest," Danny muttered. Shadow's ears twitched, but he kept moving. Lily stood near the fence line, staring out across the valley. "Does it ever feel normal?" she asked quietly. Danny didn't answer right away. "What part?" "Being watched?" He followed her gaze toward the ridge road. "It does," he said eventually. "You just learn to live with it." She nodded, though he could tell she didn't find that comforting. By afternoon, Danny returned to the kitchen floor. The board still lay flush, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He knelt and lifted it carefully. Shadow limped forward, alert but calmer than before. The cellar air was colder than the house above it. Danny descended slowly, carrying a lantern. The notebooks lay where he had left them. The small cot, the cast-iron stove, the history of whispered survival. He reached for the wooden trunk tucked beneath the shelves, one he hadn't fully examined yet. Dust rose as he dragged it into the lantern light. The hinges creaked when he opened it. Inside were bundles of letters tied with twine, old envelopes, faded stamps, dates stretching back more than a century. Danny sat on the edge of the cot and untied the first bundle. The earliest letters were written in careful, slanted script from 1890, to Samuel Brooks, from names Danny didn't recognize. They spoke of gratitude, of shelter given during violent disputes in neighboring counties, want of safety provided when no one else would open their doors, of children hidden from men who would have forced them into labor. Danny read slowly. Each page layered the farmhouse with deeper meaning. This wasn't just a place his father had refused to sell. It was a refuge, a quiet resistance, a promise kept across generations. He found another letter, dated 1963, his grandfather's name, a note from a preacher in Charleston thanking him for sheltering a family during unrest. Danny's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from weight. Shadow descended the final step and lay beside him, head resting near Danny's knee. "You knew," Danny murmured. The dog blinked. Danny reached the final bundle. These were newer, his father's handwriting. The last letter wasn't addressed. It was simply folded. Danny unfolded it carefully. "But if Danny ever returns, he'll understand why I stayed." The words were simple, but they struck deeper than any memory. "I couldn't leave the fire. Not after what your grandfather taught me. Not after what this land has seen. I know you think I chose this place over you. Maybe I did. But I hoped one day you'd come back and see what it was for. Keep the fire burning." Danny closed his eyes. All those years of resentment. All those silent holidays. All those unanswered calls. His father hadn't been avoiding him. He had been guarding something. The realization did not erase the hurt, but it shifted it. Above them, a faint creak sounded. Danny's eyes opened instantly. Shadow lifted his head too. Footsteps. Danny extinguished the lantern. Silence pressed in around them. The footsteps moved across the kitchen floor. Slow, deliberate. Danny's pulse quickened. "Lily?" he whispered upward. No response. The footsteps paused near the board. Shadow stood carefully, muscles tight. Danny reached for the underside of the trapdoor, ready to push upward if needed. Then, a soft knock. Not on the front door, on the kitchen floor. 3 gentle taps. Danny froze. Then Lily's voice drifted faintly downward. "I found something," he exhaled. Danny relit the lantern and climbed up. Lily stood near the counter holding a newspaper clipping. "I was cleaning out one of the drawers," she said. "This was folded inside." Danny took it. The headline was from nearly 10 years ago. Local developer announces Pine Hollow expansion project. Below it was Clayton Reed's photo, smiling, ambitious. But the article mentioned several surrounding properties, most already acquired, except one, Brooks Farm. Danny's jaw tightened. "He's been trying for years," Lily said quietly. Danny folded the clipping carefully. Shadow emerged from the cellar behind him. Lily looked down at the dog. "You weren't just protecting me," she said softly. Danny glanced toward the ridge road visible through the kitchen window. Clayton's interest wasn't sudden. It was strategic, long-term, calculated. And the farmhouse wasn't just land. It was the last piece. The fire crackled behind them again. Danny walked back to the hearth and stared into the flames. He had almost sold the property, almost walked away, almost let the legacy end without knowing what it meant. Shadow lay beside him, injured but unbroken. Lily stood nearby, uncertain but present. The farmhouse felt different now, not fragile, rooted. Danny looked down at the carved wood on the mantel. "You saved me." He turned to Lily. "My father stayed because someone had to," he said quietly. "And now?" she asked. Danny looked toward the kitchen floor, toward the letters, toward the cellar, toward the promise passed down. "Now," he said. "I understand." Outside, the snow began melting under the late afternoon sun. Water dripped from the eaves in slow rhythm. The ridge stood quiet. But Danny knew quiet didn't mean finished. Clayton would come again. With contracts, with pressure, with something bigger. Danny reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's back. "You rest," he said softly. Shadow's tail thumped once against the rug. The fire burned steady, and for the first time since his father's funeral, Danny felt something stronger than grief. Resolve. It didn't roar. It didn't surge. It settled. Like stone. The next morning arrived clear and cold. The last of the snow slid from the barn roof in heavy sheets. Water dripped steadily from the gutters, tapping the frozen ground like a slow clock. Danny woke before sunrise. Shadow was already awake. The dog lifted his head carefully, favoring his bandaged shoulder, but his eyes were alert, clear. "You're healing," Danny said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once. Danny stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee. The mountains rolled out before him in pale blue layers. Pine Hollow sat silent in the valley below, thin smoke drifting from scattered chimneys. He studied the ridge road, waiting. It didn't take long. Shot around mid-morning, a dark SUV appeared at the bend. It moved slowly this time, confidently. Danny didn't flinch. He simply set the mug down. Shadow rose beside him, muscles tightening. "Easy," Danny murmured. The SUV pulled all the way into the drive. Clayton Reed stepped out alone. No patrol truck, no hired men, just a leather folder tucked under one arm. He smiled as if arriving for a neighborly visit. "Morning, Danny," he called. Danny didn't step off the porch. "Morning." Clayton walked through melting snow without hesitation. Expensive boots sank slightly into slush, but he didn't seem to notice. "I thought we might talk," Clayton said lightly. "Man to man." Danny crossed his arms. "Talk." Clayton glanced briefly at Shadow. "Dog's looking better." "He is." Clayton nodded once. I'm glad." He opened the leather folder. Papers crisp, official. "I've spoken with the county board," he said calmly. "There's expansion coming to Pine Hollow. Infrastructure upgrades, jobs, investment." Danny said nothing. Clayton stepped closer. "Your property is the last holdout on this ridge. With it, the development flows cleanly. Without it, everything stalls." Danny's gaze remained steady. "Sounds like a you problem." Clayton's smile thinned. "It doesn't have to be." He held out the papers. "Final offer." Danny didn't reach for them. Clayton sighed softly. "It's more than market value. Enough to set you up anywhere you'd like. Clean break, fresh start." The words struck somewhere deep, but not the way Clayton intended. Clean break. Danny remembered every clean break he had tried to make, as leaving home at 18, cutting off arguments, walking away from calls, trying to outrun things that followed anyway. Shadow stepped slightly in front of him. Clayton noticed. "Be realistic," Clayton continued. "That house is falling apart. You can't protect it forever." Danny's jaw tightened. "It's not just a house." Clayton studied him carefully. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." For a moment, something flickered in Clayton's expression. Not curiosity, knowledge. "You've been digging," Clayton added. Danny didn't react. Clayton tapped the folder lightly. "There are complications with properties like this. Old structures, unregistered modifications, code violations." A pause. "Liabilities." Danny felt the threat without hearing it spoken. Clayton lowered his voice. "I don't want to involve inspectors, us or zoning boards, or law enforcement." The air between them shifted. "You already did," Danny said evenly. Clayton smiled faintly. "That was a misunderstanding." He held out a pen. "Sign this. I'll take care of the rest." For a brief second, Danny imagined it. The silence of a different place. No ridge road, no pressure. Shadow safe. Lily gone. No one knocking. The wind moved through the trees behind Clayton. Danny looked past him toward the kitchen window. He saw Lily inside, watching, not hiding. Watching. The carved wood still rested on the mantel. "You saved me." Danny looked back at Clayton. "No." Clayton's hand paused midair. "Excuse me?" "I'm not selling." Clayton's smile vanished. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Danny stepped down from the porch. Snow and mud soaked into his boots. Then I guess it'll be hard." Clayton's voice cooled. "You think you're protecting something noble here?" Danny didn't answer. Clayton leaned closer. "Do you know what people did in those mountains 100 years ago? The kind of men your family sheltered?" Danny met his gaze without blinking. "Men who needed shelter." Clayton's eyes hardened. "Men who brought trouble." Danny's voice remained steady. "Trouble came anyway." Silence stretched between them. Clayton straightened slowly. "You're not your father," he said quietly. Danny felt the words land, but not the way Clayton expected. You're right, Danny replied. I'm not. Clayton closed the folder sharply. Last chance. Danny didn't move. Clayton stepped back toward his SUV. You can't hold the line forever, he said over his shoulder. Danny glanced at Shadow. Oh, the dog stood firm despite the bandage. We'll see, Danny answered. Clayton climbed into his vehicle. The engine roared to life. As it pulled away, the tires spun slightly in melting snow. Danny remained standing long after the SUV disappeared. The mountains returned to quiet. Shadow moved beside him, leaning lightly against his leg. Inside the house, Lily opened the door. You didn't sign, she said. Danny shook his head. No. She stepped onto the porch slowly. He looked angry. He is. She hesitated. Will he come back? Danny considered the ridge road. Yes. The word didn't carry fear, just fact. Lily nodded once. Shadow turned his head toward the tree line again, always scanning. Danny looked down at him. You ready for round 2? He murmured. Shadow's ears flicked forward as the farmhouse stood behind them. Weathered, scarred, unmoved. Danny walked back inside and closed the door. The fire still burned, not roaring, not fading. Steady. He added one more log, and this time, he did not hesitate. Danny didn't wait for Clayton to make the next move. By dawn the following morning, he was already outside with a hammer in hand. The frost still clung to the fence posts, turning the barbed wire silver. The valley below Pine Hollow looked calm, almost gentle, but Danny no longer mistook quiet for safety. Shadow stepped carefully across the yard, slower than before, but upright. The bandage had been replaced with a lighter wrap. The limp remained, but it was smaller now. You're supposed to be resting, Danny muttered. Shadow ignored him. Danny walked to the old wooden sign near the front gate, and it had once held the family name in faded paint. Brooks Farm. The letters were barely visible now. He pulled it down. For a moment, he stood there holding it. His father's hands had carved that board decades ago. He didn't throw it away. He leaned it against the barn wall and picked up a fresh plank. Lily stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in both hands. What are you doing? She asked. Danny didn't look up. Making something clear. He measured the board slowly, carefully, then began carving. The strokes were firm but not rushed. Shadow sat beside him, watching. After an hour, the letters took shape. Not decorative, not elegant, plain. If you need shelter, knock. Danny stood back and examined it. Lily read the words quietly. He'll hate that, she said. Danny nodded. Oh, that's the point. They mounted the sign beside the gatepost, where the ridge road could see it clearly. The mountains carried sound strangely that day. Every truck engine from miles away seemed louder. Every branch snap in the woods made Lily flinch, but no vehicles came. By mid-afternoon, Danny drove into town alone. Shadow remained behind this time, under protest. Danny parked outside the small law office on Main Street. Margaret Hill had handled his father's estate. She greeted him with quiet familiarity. You look steadier, she observed. I am. Danny placed the folder of old letters on her desk. I need this protected. Margaret adjusted her glasses and skimmed the documents carefully. Her expression changed as she read. This land has historical weight, she murmured. Oh, more than you realized. Clayton wants it, Danny said. I know. She met his eyes. You're not obligated to sell. And if he pushes through zoning or inspection threats, I can respond formally. Danny exhaled slowly. I'm not running. Margaret gave a small nod. Then let's make sure you don't have to. By the time he returned to the farm, dusk had begun settling across the ridge. The sign stood firm at the gate. Lily sat on the porch steps. Shadow rose carefully when he saw the truck. Danny stepped out and crouched beside him. How's the leg? Shadow shifted his weight, still tender, but stronger. That night, they ate quietly around the small kitchen table. The tension felt different now, not sharp, but coiled. Danny cleaned his rifle at the table after dinner, not out of aggression, but maintenance, a habit. And Lily watched him. Are you scared? She asked softly. Danny considered the question honestly. Yes. She seemed surprised. But you're staying anyway. Yes. Shadow lay near the hearth, head resting between his paws. His breathing was steady. Later that evening, headlights appeared again on the ridge road. Danny saw them first through the window. He didn't stand. He didn't rush. He simply watched. The SUV slowed near the gate. The driver's window lowered slightly. Clayton's face was visible in the fading light. His eyes scanned the new sign. If you need shelter, knock. Clayton didn't smile. He stared at it for a long time. Then his gaze shifted to the house. Danny stepped into view inside the doorway. They locked eyes across distance and falling dusk. No words. No threats. Just understanding. Clayton's window rolled back up. The SUV idled for another moment. Then it drove away. Danny stayed in the doorway until the taillights vanished. Lily stepped beside him. He's not done, she said. No. Shadow limped forward and sat between them. Danny looked down at him. Neither are we. Over the next week, the snow fully melted. Mud replaced frost. The barn roof dripped steadily. Shadow's limp improved day by day. He still favored the shoulder, but he no longer hesitated to patrol the yard. One afternoon, Danny walked the property line slowly with Shadow at his side. They paused near the edge of the ridge. The valley below shimmered in early spring light. Danny rested a hand on Shadow's back. You stood your ground, he murmured. Shadow leaned into him, not as strong as before, but steady. Oh, the farmhouse behind them no longer felt like a relic. It felt claimed, protected, chosen. And for the first time, Shadow stood without trembling. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. First the thaw, softening the earth beneath the fence posts. Then the birds, testing the air with cautious song. Then the green, small at first, pushing through the mud in stubborn patches. The mountains around Pine Hollow changed color slowly, trading white for brown, then brown for a quiet shade of living. Danny noticed it the morning he stepped onto the porch and didn't brace for impact. No engines, no headlights, no sudden noise cracking through the silence. Just wind in the trees. Shadow walked beside him, gait still slightly uneven but strong. The bandage was gone, but a scar ran through the fur at his shoulder, a thin line that caught the light if you looked closely. Danny crouched and ran his hand over it. You earned that, he said quietly. Shadow leaned into the touch. Behind them, the farmhouse door opened. Lily stepped out with a folded piece of paper in her hand. I got something, she said. Danny stood. What is it? She hesitated before answering. A bus ticket. He studied her face carefully. You leaving? She nodded slowly. I found a program in Charleston. They'll take me in. School. Housing. Danny felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear this time, change. That's good, he said. It is. She walked down the steps and stood beside the gate. The sign Danny had carved still hung there. If you need shelter, knock. I didn't think people like you existed," she said quietly. Danny gave a faint smile. "They don't," he replied. "Not often." She laughed softly at that. Shadow moved closer to her, tail low but relaxed. She knelt and wrapped her arms gently around his neck, careful of the scar. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. Shadow closed his eyes briefly. Danny watched them both. "You saved me too," Lily added, standing again. Danny shook his head. "You saved yourself." The bus arrived at the bottom of the ridge later that afternoon. Danny drove her down. The valley felt smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because it no longer felt like a trap. When the bus doors opened, Lily stepped onto the first stair, then paused. She turned back. "You'll keep it burning?" she asked. Danny glanced at Shadow, then up toward the ridge where the farmhouse stood. "Yeah," he said. "We will." The bus doors closed. Dust lifted briefly from the road as it pulled away. Danny stood there longer than necessary. Shadow sat beside him. Not restless, not tense, just present. They drove back up the ridge in quiet. The farmhouse greeted them without drama. The barn door creaked once in the breeze. Danny stepped inside and walked straight to the hearth. The fire had burned low during the day. Only embers remained. He knelt. Shadow lay beside him. Danny added kindling carefully. Then a log. He struck the match. The flame caught slowly at first, then stronger. The fire rose again, light dancing across the stone walls. Danny leaned back on his heels. He wasn't the same man who had driven into Pine Hollow after the funeral. Now that man had been numb, closed, waiting to leave. This man was rooted. He rose and walked to the kitchen floor. The board lay flush, almost invisible. He didn't lift it. He didn't need to. He knew what rested beneath it. Not just stone, not just letters. A promise. A choice. Shadow padded toward the front door suddenly. Not barking. Alert. Danny followed. A knock echoed across the porch. 3 gentle taps. Not urgent. Not demanding. Just hopeful. Danny paused. He looked down at Shadow. Shadow's ears were forward. Steady. Ready. Danny reached for the handle. He smiled slightly, not out of certainty, but out of understanding. And he opened the door. The fire crackled behind him, and the smoke rose steady into the Appalachian sky. It did not flicker. It did not fade. It burned, and it would keep burning. Once, if this story touched you, I want to ask you something simple. If you believe Danny made the right choice by keeping the fire alive, comment 1. If you think you would have sold the land and walked away, comment 0. No long messages needed, just a single number. I read them all. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when it would have been easier to leave, tell us where you're watching from. I'd truly love to know how far this fire has reached. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are more stories waiting. Stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives. The next knock on that door might surprise you, and I'll see you in the next story.